Hey, Pierre.
Hey, how's it going?
Good, good. How are you?
Pretty good, thanks.
I was having some issues setting up here, but
Yeah, no
you could.
worries. I was too.
Good. Well, we're here now, so thanks for joining, Pierre. Appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you.
Uh, how,
Thanks for
how's
setting up.
yeah, no, anytime. How are things on your end?
Pretty good.
Good,
Yeah,
good.
pretty good.
Yeah, so super excited about the topic today. I read the article you shared with me. I've completely nerded out, so
Yeah, you geeked out
uh,
over it.
yeah, yeah. So I've got a whole bunch
Yeah,
of
beautiful.
subjects I wanted to touch. Hopefully we have enough time, but yeah. So we wanted to talk about last week. You and I kind of connected offline and talked about discussing traits of positive masculinity, and I think it's a good um, transition from what we've talked about around previously around toxic masculinity. So maybe it would be helpful to share some things around what we think could help in that positive masculinity side, and just wanted to get your thoughts. But what I found fascinating, at least what resonated for me, was this aspect of traditional masculinity that we've tended to kind of shy away from and walk away from. And you know just reading that literature you shared, using that strength-based approach on taking those positive qualities from traditional masculinity and really building on those, because those seem to serve us and have worked well for us in the past. So why reinvent the wheel? So anyways,
Yeah.
just wanted to table that, but get your thoughts.
Yeah, that's kind of a good way to look at it. It's like hmm, I think when the authors of this put so the article that we're looking at is called Identifying, Affirming, and Building Upon Male Strengths. And it's sort of the Sentinel article around positive masculinity. And a fair bit's been written about positive masculinity since that time. But I think to your point, rather than create a sort of new and maybe less approachable model, it sort of takes some of the traditional elements of traditional norms of masculinity and looks at the ones that are most adaptive, most helpful, most strengths affirming, and most approachable to guys, and underscores them in a way that feels like it honors the traits and aspects without sort of vilifying them,
Mm-hmm.
and also allows for some middle ground where it's not taken to any extreme whereby it becomes rigid like or sort of fodder for folks who might describe kind of toxic masculinity. And
Mm-hmm.
so, yeah, they're really interesting, and they picked 10 of them that we'll dive
Yeah.
into today.
Absolutely. And I think,
Yeah,
yeah, the biggest piece you mentioned there is the extremes, right? And we've touched on this previously too, is when we tend to take things to an extreme, that's when it becomes harmful. And the other side of things that you mentioned was not being rigid, but having that capability to adapt.
yeah,
And
for sure.
that's almost anything in life, right? Like you're going to be dealt certain set of cards and you just need to be able to adapt to that, and that applies to masculinity too, right? And there's
Yeah,
and as you mentioned, there's certain traits that are positive, and we've created this stigma around those, and I think instead of being rigid as men, we should be able to adapt and really leverage those traits to our advantage. And I think that's where that I appreciated the strength based approach is, let's not focus on the weaknesses or the things you can change, but let's look at the qualities that you have within you and leverage them to be able to bring a positive influence. So yeah, I think that was the biggest piece. And one of the other things that really jumped out to me was even the reframing. And I think I see it quite frequently, and I'm also guilty of it, is when we even our words in terms of when, our partners or our friends tell us, hey, you need help or you need to do something different. And that's what the article touched on, is maybe it's changing how we look at things, where it's like, as a man, um, I'm not the best version of myself. How can I remove those barriers rather than saying I need help or there's something wrong with me?
Hmm. Yeah,
So
yeah,
again,
that's
just
great.
want to throw that out and get your thoughts.
Yeah, uh, I like that. I think that probably tends to be the biggest barrier from what I've experienced in working with men historically in more traditional forms of mental health care, whether that's in therapy or uh, in my work as a psychiatrist, that often there is a sense that um, by seeking out those levels of care, that there was something implicitly wrong with me and something that I needed to change um, that was deficient in some way. And
Mm-hmm.
so a lot of the positive psychology uh, models have been sort of moved into the the approach around positive masculinity. It's sort of modeled around positive psychology.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think part of the positive psychology, um, it, it's focused on, like we touched on, strengths,
Yeah.
um, as opposed to kind of, again, focusing on. And I think there's that narrative of around, okay, well, I need to do this better, or I'm not doing this well enough, rather than focusing on, okay, well, what are the things I'm doing well, and how can I build on those? And I think
Yeah.
that's an
How can I do
aspect
them
of
better?
yeah, positive psychology that I appreciate. Um, yeah, and I think one of the other things I picked up on was, um, I, I think there's the narrative that men also don't know how to express themselves, and I think we need to
Mm.
probably take a step back. And what I gathered is, it's not that men don't know how to express themselves, it's how they express themselves. And I
Hmm.
think there's the challenge around verbal expression, whereas men are more inclined to express themselves using nonverbal cues, whether it's through body language, facial expressions, stuff like that. And when we say, oh, men don't know how to express themselves, again, there's that, by saying that, like, if I were to receive that from someone, I would immediately get defensive, because now I'm
Yeah.
being told I'm not doing something, whereas I feel like I am. I'm just not doing it in a way that's probably conducive for the other person to hear me, but it's coming
Hmm.
through. Um, um, yeah, it's coming
Yeah.
through in different ways.
Yeah.
Um, there's a
Beautiful.
question here from someone. So far, I'm hearing flexibility and strengths. Can you give some specific strengths that men should showcase? Pierre, do you want to kind of build on that, and I can kind of share my thoughts after?
Yeah, sure. I mean, that takes us into the 10 ones that are chosen,
Yeah.
or that were chosen in this article. And the authors here uh, expanded to 10, and also recognize that they're not totally, the traits are not totally inclusive,
Correct.
they're not comprehensive. So there may be others as well that we could add, that they're not necessarily 100% limited to men, that they're traits that and values that might be seen as priorities, that might be seen as adaptive for people of all backgrounds and genders, but that they fit very closely with some of the more traditional norms of masculinity. So they're more approachable for many men, and they include men's relational styles, and specifically around that, um, the tendency to interact and engage with one another around shared actions and shared mission. The second is male ways of caring, and what they described here, and what's often referenced is the sort of protective nature of men within communities, within families,
and, and
within
loyalty.
workplaces. Yeah, for sure,
Yeah, yeah.
for sure. Um, the third is generative fatherhood, and so a focus on helping to build the next generation and seeing value within the role of fatherhood, within the role of parenting, and sort of taking on specific ways of parenting, ones
Hmm.
that tend to be more action focused. The fourth is male self-reliance. And in this one, there's really an emphasis on moderation. And
Hmm.
so um, there has been obviously perhaps not obviously, but there has been quite a lot of research on male isolation and the tendency for many men, um, I think I certainly can speak for myself, um, myself included, to feel like we have to be entirely self-sufficient without necessarily seeking help or while being a lone wolf. And in
Hmm.
this case, there is a reflection on the positive element of being self-reliant, on being able to care for oneself, and to be resourceful around challenges. The fifth
Yeah.
one, yeah,
Sorry, Pierre, just
yeah,
to build
yeah,
on that, I think, and we touched on it earlier, is really that moderation, right? I mean, there's obviously positives to being self-reliant, but then you
yeah,
also need to recognize your own blind spots as a man, and being able to ask for help or advice. And I think that's part of one of the things that we found, at least reading through here too, is moving past that self-reliance, and obviously there's a cultural aspect to it too that we'll touch on later, but that's, I think that was the biggest piece that I took out of it,
yeah,
um, is moderating any of these, right? And especially the self-reliance piece, like, yeah, it's a good
yeah,
quality to be independent, but you also need to know when to ask for help.
for sure. And I think that's the reality around all of this, that when taken to extremes, many of these features can be limiting in some way. They can get in the way of our own value or our capacity to provide value to other people. In many ways, uh, in extreme variants and extreme versions, some of these features have been used and labeled as toxic or hegemonic or negative in some way. But yeah, to uh, to this point, loyalty, protecting, active, progenerative, self-reliance, and moderation, it is a good start. There are more, and we'll touch upon them. Um,
Yeah,
we'll touch
yeah,
upon them today.
yeah. No, I'm sorry to cut you off there, Pierre. I'll let
No,
you
no, that's
continue.
good. It's good to, I think, to dig into them, and there are quite a few of them. And so perhaps I'll just I'll we can just discuss what the rest of them are just briefly, and then start to dig into certain ones that feel important. Um,
Absolutely.
the the others are the worker provider tradition of men. That it's a really important component of self-esteem and identity. Male courage, daring, and risk-taking. That may show up in protecting communities. It may show up in sport. And to that end, the group orientation of boys and men, often to band together in groups toward a common mission and purpose. Humanitarian service, fraternal organizations. Men's use of humor, which I think is a really great one,
Hmm.
because in many ways, sort of classic forms of male humor um, tend to be um, sort of. disarming. They tend to disarm and sort of reduce tension, and they tend to bond it over, kind of busting
Exactly.
chops.
Yeah, I was
Yeah,
gonna say that. I think there's a level of bonding that occurs between men through that humor, or you know, even it's like I find it quite fascinating. I play a lot of sports, and
yeah,
like when you're competing against others, you'll be trash talking each other. But at the end of the game, there's that. You see it in sports all the time. Like, when a playoff series ends, like they'll shake hands and they'll put everything that happened behind them, knowing that they were competing. Um,
yeah,
but at the end of the day, you're still like have respect for the other person, right? And I find that quite admirable, and important as well, knowing that you can compete, but also have that respect for each other after the fact.
yeah, for sure, for sure. And also that sort of element of competition and busting balls um, can also be quite bonding. Many guys who have had direct competition with one another, trash talk one another, tend to sort of form the greatest and closest friendships.
Hmm.
Yeah,
Yeah, absolutely.
yeah,
Yeah.
man. And the last one is heroism, sort of the
Yep.
willingness to dare um, in order to potentially risk even one's life to in the service of others. Yeah,
Yeah, yeah, no, and I mean, again, like just highlighting the fact that even like things like courage and risk taking, we touched on it, but it is within moderation. Like,
hmm,
there's a difference between being reckless with your risk taking, but also taking the risk to step out of your comfort zone, trying something different, and really opening yourself up to different ideas, perspectives. That in itself, I think, is courageous and a form of risk taking, because now you're putting yourself in a vulnerable spot. You're saying,
yeah,
"Hey, I don't have all the answers, but I would love to learn more." And I think that, to me, is courage. Courage as a man is also being able to move past that self-reliance and ask for help, when you need it, when you're struggling, because we don't have all the answers.
hmm, yeah, for sure. And I think that sort of uh, part of what feels important to normalize between men and in work with men, um, that through shared experience, through action orientation, through empathic experiences in which we are able to demonstrate vulnerability, uh, we recognize that no man has everything figured out, that we don't, even guys who might appear to be um, to sort of appear to be fully competent, fully put together, struggle at times, and that ends up being quite bonding in a way
Hmm.
um, that may not necessarily be included in these kind of rules around or sort of guidelines around positive masculinity, in part because perhaps um, it's not a traditional, like it's not seen as a traditional norm for a man or a traditional norm of masculinity, to be vulnerable, to have these shares. But there's a recognition too in this that these 10 core tenets of positive masculinity, that they highlight the adaptive, social, pro-social, healthy elements that are consistent with traditional norms of masculinity. In other
Hmm.
words, these aren't necessarily like man laws. They're not like the way in which every man ought to be.
Yeah.
And at the same time, it's like taking traditional norms and pulling out, distilling the elements that are approachable, that work well, that tend to help men and help men to help others in the community and in their families.
Yeah, no,
Yeah.
absolutely. And you mentioned it earlier too, that these aren't all inclusive. There's, there's more. But I think the thing I wanted to highlight again is there's, again, there's this perspective that as men, because certain traits of masculinity are considered aggressive or abusive, we need to completely change the way we show up as men in society today. And I think what, at least reading through this, I realized that that's not the case. There's qualities or traits of masculinity that we can, again, in moderation, apply in our daily lives and still be healthy, um, and embrace certain things that we need to modify. And I think by doing that, you're setting yourself up for success rather than going to another extreme and saying, I'm going to disown all these masculinity traits and try something completely different. And I think that's where the confusion comes in, because men don't know what to do. They're like, okay, well,
Hmm.
I these are the things I do, but I'm being told that they're they're too aggressive or abusive or whatever. So what do I do now?
Hmm.
And what kind of behaviors do I learn? So I think that's kind of what I wanted to highlight.
Yeah, that makes sense. That makes sense. Uh, it reminds me of an article that was put out a few years ago. I feel like it might have been in Esquire, but it was documenting. It's interesting because I not a magazine that I normally read, but I saw it on the stand, and it was all about sort of new models of masculinity for um, for young men and adolescents who are in essence becoming men. And I think it followed uh, one adolescent um, boy in high school who was really sort of at the cusp of graduating and sort of transitioning into manhood. And one of the quotes that really resonated from that article was that for years he's been hearing in essence how not to show up, but no one's necessarily supported a model for how to show up, for how boys and young men um, can show
Mm-hmm.
up in an acceptable, healthy way. Yeah, and
Yeah.
so in a lot of ways, I find myself using or referring to these, if not explicitly, um, then just the way that I might show up um, uh, in that list. Okay, and so it implicitly feels like a part of the way in which um, I might opt to work with men who may be struggling to define their own sort of style of masculinity, wanting to show
Mm-hmm.
up in a particular way, but also not wanting to be, also beginning to sort of judge the possibility that they may go to an extreme. I want to show up in this way, and also I'm not sure how to do it in a way that feels moderate, doesn't go to an extreme, doesn't have me show up as some variant of myself that I really don't want to. And
Yeah.
so, Here in Home and Life Solutions asks, in that list, which trait of manliness rises to the top, and how are you modeling that today? Hmm.
Yeah. I think, I mean,
Yeah,
I could take that and get your
yeah, go
thoughts,
for it.
Pierre. But I think for me, the biggest one that jumps out is the self-reliance.
Hmm.
And not because that's something I want to fully embrace. I think
Yeah.
when I think self-reliance, it really forces me to reflect. And the reflection I get is, for me to be a better person, I need to be more humble.
Hmm.
And if I'm more humble, I also need to recognize that I'm not fully reliant just on my own. And I mentioned this earlier. I have my own blind spots. There's things I don't even know that I don't know.
Yeah.
And when I'm able to shift away from that extreme of being fully self-reliant, and kind of find a middle ground where I'm open to other perspectives and beliefs and ideas where I can also learn from others, I think that in itself, for me, is the biggest strength as a man, um, and something I'd like to model even for my son is, having that humility and openness to listen to other ideas.
Mm-hmm. Mm. Yeah, I like that. I like that. I feel like that's important, using your own resources to confront challenges that might emerge in life.
Hmm.
Um, hmm. You know, I think that the worker provider tradition for me has been a really important one, or at least
Hmm.
one that I found myself turning to quite frequently. Um, and that's changed, I think, even over the last few years. I think I've recognized too that there have been times during which I've uh, I've defined myself um, and my competence as a man based on how much I was accomplishing or achieving, what I was bringing in, and I think that perhaps it I might have taken that to an extreme historically, but I saw a lot of pride in that throughout much of
Hmm.
my life.
Hmm.
And I think that increasingly I'm finding that male ways of caring and relational styles have been um, most important to me over the last couple of years as I've worked with men. And so uh, that to that question, I think what rises to the top for me are those two, the way in which I might relate to other men and ways of caring that feel um, approachably masculine.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I guess to kind of build on that, Pierre, like how are you modeling that? Like, what are you doing differently now that you have that kind of awareness?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think so. I would say probably, hmm, I think historically I've been pretty isolated and maybe overly self-reliant. And
Hmm.
so there was a tendency not to reach out for help or reach out for engaging other guys, even if I didn't necessarily need to do anything. Like
Hmm.
we didn't have a task to complete. Historically, it was just based on task orientation and completion for me. If I was gonna reach out to another guy, it was gonna be because um, we had a plan um, to like work on a project together.
Yeah.
Um, and and so it was rare that I might find myself reaching out to another man in a way that feels um, inviting of connection, still action oriented, but not with the intention necessarily of just carrying out that action. I think
Hmm.
what I find is that I have a tendency to reach out more to other men, um, to friends and family members, um, to just connect. And it might start with a shared action. It may start with um, a sort of approachable kind of shoulder to shoulder engagement so that um, it feels sort of approachable and easygoing. But the intention is really to connect in a deeper way. And
Hmm.
so I might find myself taking the lead on I more often find myself taking the lead on that and basically saying, this is what I'm going through, or this is what I see in that may be happening in how we relate to one another, or how you're showing up in a particular way, or how I'm showing up, and allowing deeper conversations to be put on the table,
Mm-hmm.
and not sort of waiting for the other guy to kind of bring that up. So I find myself modeling shared vulnerability, and even sort of the ease to just be with one another without necessarily having a clear agenda,
Mm-hmm.
um, and sort of using leadership in that way. Now, I would say also in my work with men, um, that sort of way of carrying um, allows guys to feel um, more comfortable in expressing their own vulnerabilities, having seen that I might be comfortable sharing mine.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And so it has meant that in a lot of ways, I've had to shift a style of being pretty closed off and walled off in many ways, emotionally, um, connectively.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and that part has been pretty frightening, I have to say.
Yeah.
It's felt really uncomfortable at times, even when it's not like by any means too deep. Like even if I just
Yeah.
sort of scratch the surface and start to like get into um, slightly deeper vulnerabilities, it feels uncomfortable at
Yeah.
first. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think, I mean, you and I both have talked about our own men's group and creating those forums where you can have that shared vulnerability, and I think that's important. And often, sometimes you need someone to lead it, but
Hmm.
when everyone comes to the table, you've now set the stage for having those conversations and moving past that self-reliance. Now you've got a community of men who are willing to learn and share their experiences and support each other, which I think it's important. And
Yeah.
in the comments here, same thing. In terms of the provider role, I've struggled with it too. Like, I feel like the relationships I'm in, whether it's with my family as a child or even in my partnerships, it's I want to be the provider, whether it's fixing things or even around the home. It's like, okay, I have to you know fix all the things around.
Yeah.
And I think there's a aspect of, again, humility, where it's like, okay, and I've had to learn that the hard way, even in my relationships, where my partner's not often looking for a solution. They're
Yeah.
probably looking to be just heard. And how am I showing up in that regard? Just listening, and not immediately searching for a solution. And that's something I've really had to work on, because most of the time when someone comes to you, whether it's your friend or your partner, and I've mentioned this before, they're not necessarily looking for a solution. They're probably just looking to be heard. They
Yeah.
just want to share something and they want to be heard. And I think as men, and I don't want to generalize, but most of the time we struggle with that because we're like, well, okay, this person has a problem. Let me solve it for them. And we're robbing that other person of that opportunity to be heard. Um, but anyways, I'm not sure what your thoughts are, Pierre.
Yeah. I think it's a really important one. Um, and I, Aaron, I think the I struggle with that too. I think many guys do. And for God, I totally relate to the desire to want to fix. I think it's a common thing for many guys, and
Mm-hmm.
so I find myself more often than not helping to helping guys to feel more comfortable with just sitting with another
Mm-hmm.
person, just being with another person without necessarily, and often that's usually that's partners, but that can also be coworkers or family members, without necessarily fixing something for the other person.
Mm-hmm.
Fixing something for the other person kind of implicitly assumes that you know what the other person needs,
Yeah.
that you have the answer, that your
Yeah.
answer is going to work for them. Um, and so, yeah,
Yeah.
navigating the humility element of it feels pretty important. It's also not a, like, most of us are pretty uncomfortable with the idea of Nate. Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
great. Um,
Right.
thanks, Nate. The impulse to fix is really strong. And
Yeah.
also, there's not great modeling um, of humility.
Yeah. You're creating a hierarchy, right? It's like, oh, you've
Yeah.
come to me, I have a solution for you. Whereas it's no, let's be humble here and let's hear you out. Let's share your experience. And I think that obviously comes with time. And obviously you and I, and I'm sure other people struggle with that.
Yeah.
And I find sitting in those men's group really allows you to improve on that because
Mhm.
now you've got guys typically in similar situations coming and sharing their own experiences and their own um, journeys of learning and having those lessons through life. And I think that in itself builds that humility where you realize that you're not the only one struggling. You're also figuring it out like everyone else.
Mhm. Very much. Very much. And
Yeah.
Nate, you're spot on here. Humility is hugely underrated. And I'd say probably for most, I mean, I think when I've mentored coaches, therapists, physicians before, um, whether that's in sort of any helping nature, uh, I think that's often been the value that I've promoted the most strongly when I've
Mm-hmm.
asked what's the most important thing about how to show up as someone who helps other people, um, no matter what capacity that is. It's usually humility. It's
Mm-hmm.
the assumption that you're not going to have all the answers. That's um, in many ways reassuring, relieving of responsibility. Um, it also allows you to help to support the other person in creating solutions that work for them. Uh,
Absolutely. Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. I do want to shift the conversation a little bit here for the
Yeah.
last few minutes we have, and you and I touched on this last week, and I recently read the book Four Agreements. You've read it in the past. I think along the conversation we've been having so far, I think it's personally, I feel it's relevant to talk about the agreements we have with ourselves, right?
Mhm.
And for people who aren't familiar with the book, I would highly recommend it. But the four agreements are being impeccable with your word, never assume anything, don't take things personally, and then the last one's do your best. And for me, the one that resonate or the two that resonated the most were the first one, which is being impeccable with your word,
Yeah.
and the last one, doing your best. Or yeah, like knowing that you're doing your best. And I think why I find it relevant for this discussion is as men, we have such a harsh dialogue with ourselves. Like, we're so hard on ourselves. And I'm not saying um, like only men do that. I think people in general do that.
Yeah.
But for me, it's so important to recognize that because if I'm speaking negatively to myself or I'm using harsh words, I can't expect people to come into my life and speak to me in a better way because I'm setting that standard. I'm inviting that into my life. And until we don't do that work of recognizing how we speak to ourselves, we're going to keep repeating those patterns. And I truly believe in that now, and having that recognition. And the reason why doing your best is also important to me is it also creates this um, sense of humility because you recognize that, yeah, you don't have all the answers. You're doing the best with what you have. and it also invites compassion and grace into your life when you do make mistakes.
Hmm.
And I'm starting to see that, like, even last weekend, I was spending time with my son, and I wasn't happy with how things turned out, and how I kind of guided him and parented him. And in the past, I would have carried that guilt and shame until I saw him again. But I took a moment to pause and tell myself, well, I'm doing my best. Again, being a father is, there's no guidebook that comes with it. But in that moment, by having that compassion and grace, I was able to recognize that I am doing my best, but now I'm also learning, and now it's my responsibility to improve from the lessons I've taken rather than repeating them. But yeah, anyways, I just wanted to put that out there because I do truly believe in the four agreements and just looking at things so differently.
That's huge, man. Like, that that's worthy of some big props, truly. I don't think, um, well, my experience has been that um, it's hard to find the middle ground, that the sense of being hard on ourselves, harsh on ourselves, is meant to sort of motivate us. In fact, my experience has been, and I'm a really tough critic on myself, like
Mm-hmm.
very willing to give grace to other people and compassion to other people, and also really hard on myself. Um, and and so learning to change the dialogue that you might give to yourself is not easy, especially after decades of getting used
Yeah.
to how that sounds, how that looks for us. And one thing that I often hear, and like it's sort of, even if it's not necessarily explicitly stated, is there's this sort of fear that if I'm not hard on myself, I'm going to get complacent.
Complacent. Yeah.
Yeah. And there's a big, it feels like there's a big difference between recognizing the grace that we can give ourselves while also, to your point, saying, I'm committed to making changes in some important way. Um, but doing that flexibly feels inviting as opposed to the kind of harsh, um, judgmental ways in which many of us as guys um, have been so accustomed to showing up for ourselves. So you're like
Mm-hmm.
showing up impeccably, um, having your words um, be meaningful to yourself as well, in
Mm-hmm.
addition to recognizing that you're doing your best. And something I think, um, something I'd like personally to work on more in the coming few months and years.
Yeah, no,
Yeah.
absolutely. And that's been a goal of mine too, is just being mindful of that. And to your point, I think in my personal experience or based on what I've seen is often those words or the way we speak to ourselves comes from a certain point in our life, whether
Hmm.
it was how our the stuff that our parents said to us, people that we grew up around. And I'm not blaming anyone. I'm saying what I'm trying to get at is often that dialogue is picked up somewhere along the way.
Yeah.
Um, and and there's never any ill intentions like from our parents or family, but when we get to a certain state in our lives, it's recognizing where did that come from? Why have
Hmm.
I carried it? Because we keep repeating that pattern and we keep bringing that up into our lives, and until we don't pause and really understand where that came from and recognize that it doesn't serve us, and it's only our responsibility to bring that change, then it won't happen. And what I see, and people have compassion for the most is they keep repeating that same behavior and pattern, not recognizing where it came from, or they're just sitting there blaming external factors when, you know, the power lies within themselves. And most people give that power away so easily. And that's where you know, I think that's, if we can recognize how much power we have, we can bring about so much change in our lives. But even the situations that occur, you know, in our lives, and the outcomes.
Yeah, no one's gonna come and give us permission to necessarily change that. And even if they did, you'd have to accept that invitation. And so I think the last 2 points in particular that have been noted in comments feels important.
Yeah.
Conditioning has been placed on us since day one, really, in our lives. There's not
Hmm.
um, there may not be a story that uh, there may not be a sort of a point at which the stories that have been written, that we've written and that other people have written with us, um, there's not usually a point at which those stories get challenged in a meaningful way. And so we're conditioned and continue to kind of repeatedly do the same things, to Nate's point. Um,
Hmm.
and and my take on those stories is often that exploring how they might serve us allows us to be gentle with ourselves. Um, because those stories, in some cases, the stories have not served us in any meaningful way. Um, but in many cases, there are important parts of the story that we might be afraid to veer away from, um, that we don't want to give up. And there's this fear that if I give up this story, that I'm not good enough, for example, not smart enough, that I'm going to suddenly get um, a big head, that I'm going to get like really, I'm going to stop trying to learn. I'm going to assume that I know everything and that I'm arrogant. And and so there may be baby there may be like a baby in there, and we have to make sure that we're not like throwing the baby out with the bathwater. And
Hmm.
so understanding what's the baby and what's all the junk that we're actually trying to get rid of um, feels like it allows us to be a little gentler. That way we know, we can hang on to the part that feels important. We can hang on to humility, or we can hang on to the desire to hustle or the desire to learn more, while getting rid of perhaps the self-critical parts or the self-judgmental parts that tend to put us down.
Hmm.
Doing that is not always easy. In many ways, it is a matter of repeatedly engaging in behaviors, repeatedly engaging in a style of conversation to ourselves that is more forgiving, um, while also a style of engagement with ourselves that pushes us forward to meet the values and goals that we set for ourselves.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, Pierre, there's an aspect of comfort that comes with it too, right? And I
Yeah.
think that's where people really struggle to step out of that narrative or what they're used to or the patterns, because we feel comfortable in the way things are. And
Yeah.
any change requires a little discomfort or stepping out of our comfort zone. And you know, I mean, it's cliche, but that's where the most growth happens, is when we step out. And that's where we can also change the way we speak to ourselves, and the energy we bring into our lives. And but anyways, yeah, I wanted to kind of build that into our discussion around traits of positive masculinity, because I think the way we speak to ourselves and how harsh we are with um, our our shortcomings is significant, and it builds into everything we've talked about today, in terms of those qualities that we need to really build on, and
Hmm.
within moderation. Traditional masculinity has worked for generations. So how can we, instead of saying, oh, this is no longer works for us, how can we take the things we know that have worked well and really build on that, and find the sweet spot is where, I really wanted to focus the conversation today, and just wanted to get your thoughts before we come to an end here.
Yeah, I think that point is really important. Um, because uh, like anything, the the norms of traditional masculinity have been, um, well, like anything, they have their advantages and their setbacks. And the setbacks are often um, that generally those norms tend to be held really rigidly. And I think what we're discovering here and just going through elements of positive masculinity is that the elements themselves are not implicitly bad, but the rigid holding um, of expectations around them that don't allow for Nate, you didn't
Yeah.
derail, so thank you, and Martin
Yeah.
below. Um, but the rigid holding of expectations to show up in only one particular way as a man, and that alone being the sort of only permissible way, is really problematic for men. We know that men who hold on to very rigid norms around traditional masculinity are not willing to flex, tend to have worse outcomes when it comes to mental health, to life expectancy, to medical health. And often that is related to the lack of willingness to be vulnerable, to get help, um, to not hustle when when our bodies are telling us that we need a rest or we need a break,
Mm-hmm.
to not be willing um, to uh, to connect our within our families. I appreciate the mention. Traditional masculinity, when excessively held, hasn't always served us. And I think it's
No.
important to articulate that. And also, many of the elements of traditional masculinity are part of how many guys see ourselves as men, and can be extraordinarily helpful and are extraordinarily helpful. And
Mm-hmm.
so, if what we're seeing is a really sort of rigid, myopic view of what masculinity looks like, yeah, it's not served us.
Mm-hmm.
But I think if what we're saying is, uh, A, all men are real men, in essence, there is no like attempt
Yeah.
to sort of be a real man, and marginalize guys who um, may not show up with those the sort of traditional sort of rigid traits. We're able to look at we're able to look at elements of traditional masculinity that may serve us, that we can be
Mm-hmm.
proud of.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I think that's amazing. And yeah, that in itself is powerful, that all men are real men. And we don't know what a definition is, right? Like we're just figuring it out. Everyone's figuring it out themselves. And I think if you're able to find that flexibility and moderation in those qualities, then I think you're on a better path. And I think that's what uh, we should all be striving for. But Pierre, again, I want to thank you for having this
Thank you.
conversation. I thoroughly enjoyed it. I want to thank
Likewise.
everyone that interacted, viewed this, provided their input. Like that really helped us also kind of think outside a little bit and have a valuable discussion. And for people that are been tuning in, we're going to be having more of these. And we would love to hear, like either Pierre or myself would love to hear from people and hear ideas around what we can discuss, right?
Yeah, for sure. Like, if anyone who's still on now has like a strong idea, just throw it up. But anyone who's listening to this or is watching this and after the fact, please feel free to reach out to either of us with ideas or to comment.
Absolutely.
Yeah, yeah,
All
we're
right.
looking to
Well,
make a thing of this.
yeah, for sure. Well, I'll let you get on with your day here.
Cool, man.
Thanks again.
It's good
Appreciate
to
it.
see you.
Yeah, likewise. Well, I'm sure we'll be chatting soon here.
Yeah, no
And
doubt.
then obviously doing another one of these. So yeah.
Yep. Thank you.
Okay.
Furkan, good
Take
to see
care.
you.
Yeah,
Bye, guys.
likewise.